Hello there, you're watching the press preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. So it's time to see what's making the headlines with the political editors of the Daily Mirror and The Sun on Sunday, John Stevens and Kate Ferguson. Very good evening to both of you. And they will both be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's take a look then at what's making those front pages. And the Financial Times has word of the German government green-lighting the export of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine with the aim of bolstering Ukrainian forces' ability to defend themselves. The Guardian leads with that story as well. Their headline, Berlin agrees to send tanks to Ukraine in historic move. The Daily Telegraph describes it as a hammer blow for Vladimir Putin. The Metro carries the results of a study which found communities in the north of England have received substantially less of the government's levelling up funding than their southern counterparts. The Express carries a warning from pensioners' groups of the Chancellor against a Treasury plan to increase the state pension age again 11 years earlier than expected. The Mirror leads with the fallout from the Zara Alina murder case and the failings of the probation service. Another warning to the Chancellor in the Mail that he needs to come up with a plan to grow the economy after the country's debt hit £2.5 trillion. And the Times also reflects on today's economic news that growth prospects have actually declined ahead of the budget in March. And the Star raises the spectre of Chinese technology turning our fridges, laptops or even doorbells into spying devices for Beijing. While The Sun tells us about production difficulties on a game show spin-off of the hit drama series Squid Games. And just a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you can see on screen now and during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. So let's get stuck in with John Stevens and Kate Ferguson then. Very good evening to both of you. Lovely to see you both. A number of different stories on the front pages I noticed today. But, John, there is one story that has led a few of them, and that is what appears to be an imminent decision by Germany to actually send tanks to Ukraine, having prevaricated for some time. Let's show The Guardian, first of all, with their lead headline there.
Yeah, so this has been a story, as you say, it's been kicking around for the last few days and weeks. Volodymyr Zelensky has been appealing to the West for tanks. He's been saying that Ukraine needs about 300 tanks if they're going to have any chance at defeating Russia. They're concerned that Russia is planning a spring offensive, that they're going to try and take more territory. And countries have seemed to be dithering on this decision. And part of this is because the Ukrainians have wanted these Leopard tanks, which are made in Germany, and then they're held by other countries in Europe, places like Poland. But there's restrictions on them as part of the contract when Poland bought them. It said that if you wanted to export them again, you'd need to get permission from Germany. And Germany's been hesitant to do this. They've been concerned that they don't want to just be Germany and European countries acting. They wanted to kind of act in lockstep with the US. But it seems we're finally getting there. We heard at the end of last week that the UK is going to send about 14 of their Challenger tanks. And then today, the news that Poland's going to send about 14 and Germany is going to send about 14. I think just before we were about to come on air, there was news breaking in the US. It looks like they're going to send about 30 tanks, I think it was. And I was just counting up the mass of that. I think that's about 70 tanks, which is a quarter away to 300. So nowhere near there yet, but hopefully it will make some kind of difference, their efforts to defeat Ukraine.
That's right.
Defeat Russia.
Yeah, and looking at the Guardian's report here, they reflect on some of the reasons that perhaps Germany has been dragging its feet, Kate. They're saying that the groundbreaking decision, as they put it, by Germany ends months of painful debate and soul-searching and will put German tanks in use on the battlefield in Europe for the first time since the Second World War. And if we turn to the Financial Times as well, they also reflect on some of those misgivings amongst some in Germany about the risk of escalation were they to send tanks. Do you think those arguments have had any sympathy amongst other allies?
Well, the short answer to that is probably no. I mean, I think most viewers and most allies of Germany will be thinking, why has it taken so long? Why are they dithering, dragging their feet? What's the point of producing these tanks in a NATO power, in a Western ally, if you're not willing to arm a country when they're under siege by a cruel dictatorship like Putin. But as you point out in those headlines, it's actually a huge move by Germany, because since the Second World War, Germany stayed way out of all military business in Europe and the world. They have this covenant on their tanks, which means we can sell them to you, but you've got to get permission from us before you can export them elsewhere. They've been incredibly wary of anything that could be seen to kind of ratchet up military tensions or manoeuvring in Europe. And that is why they've wanted to be, as John just described, in lockstep with the US. But I think this is a huge story tonight. Finally, we've seen Germany historically move on its refusal to send tanks to other countries. They've announced today they will, or they're going to probably formally announce it tomorrow. And that means lots of other allies, lots of other countries can now send their Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. John pointed out that Ukraine are going to need quite a lot of these tanks to make a real difference in that war. But it's still a huge step change in the kind of military assistance we're giving.
Well, that's right. And John, you mentioned the fact that there's also reports tonight suggesting that the US may well confirm that they are sending their Abrams tanks as well. And they've been reluctant to do that, hadn't they? They were keen for Germany to send its tanks, but they were saying that the Abrams tanks are very big, unwieldy, difficult in terms of the maintenance, if you like. They're fuel hungry as well. So there were plenty of arguments being made by the Americans as well against sending their own tanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no tank expert, but from reading about it, it sounds like they're much more complicated to operate. The reason they particularly wanted these German-made Leopard tanks is they're much easier to train on, much easier to kind of get sent over and start being used quite quickly. But we have seen quite a step change. If you think right back to the beginning of this war, almost a year ago. Remember when the UK was first sending arms supplies and you saw diagrams of the flight paths and they're having to fly around Germany because there were concerns that Germans didn't even want these kind of armed defences going to Ukraine, even through their airspace. We have kind of seen a massive change from there to where we are now. However, it does seem that every stage during this war, the West has been quite slow to act. And I wonder what difference it would have made if the West had been much better at arming Ukraine before the Russians had started their invasion.
You're nodding there, Kate. I mean, the other issue as well, to be born in all of this, is the issue of presenting a united front. Russia would potentially want to capitalise on any kind of divisions within the Allies.
Yeah, I think John was making an interesting point, though, because obviously the reason Germany is so reluctant, so reticent to send military equipment and aid to other countries is because of the memory and the history of the Second World War. But obviously what we're seeing now in Europe is the first major war in Europe since the Second World War by another brutal dictator who represses his own people and wants to repress and conquer large swathes of Europe if he was given the chance. So, you have to balance up that history, which it's very clear and well documented why you'd have an uncomfortable history of militarization in Germany with a totally changed context now. Yeah, your point is totally right about the united front. NATO, the West have wanted to present a united front all the way through. And you know what? Broadly, we have. But what this decision speaks to, and the cold, hard facts of it, is that this war will be won because of tanks, because of guns, because of soldiers, not because of sanctions. And that's where the West really has to put their money, their tanks, their weaponry where their mouth is, and arm this democratic country to stand up for itself and its borders against an undemocratic country.
So potentially a big story tonight. No confirmation as yet. That may well come tomorrow on these various tank announcements. Let's move on then to some of the other stories around. And the Metro has taken your interest, John. Their front page story is all about levelling up, and they say it's grim up north. So why are they using that headline?
Yes, so we've had a lot of levelling up in the papers in the last couple of weeks. Last week, we had that announcement from Rishi Sunak, which didn't seem to go terribly well. There were a lot of areas that were quite angry that they'd missed out on the cash. And obviously, when Rishi Sunak went to go and make the announcement, he filmed that video in the back of the car without wearing his seatbelt. And we're hearing more about levelling up in tomorrow's papers. There's a big gathering taking place in Manchester, the Convention of the North, which is a gathering of politicians and business leaders. You're going to see Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, his Labour opposite number, Lisa Nandy, making speeches there. People like Tracy Brabin, a Labour mayor in the North, Andy Burnham, lots of figures out tomorrow talking about investment in the North. And the story on the front page of the Metro is some figures from the IPPR. And they're saying that if the North was a country and you compared it to other countries in Europe, it would have a lower level of private and public investment than every other country apart from Greece. And I mean, these figures have been slightly fiddled in that they're not looking, obviously, the North isn't its own country. You're not including London's figures there. So they are slightly out of step. I think there is a feeling here, it's kind of building on this feeling from last week, that perhaps not all the places that should have been getting investment have been getting investment. I remember back at the last election in 2019, part of the reason that Boris Johnson did very well in lots of places that hadn't voted Tory before, part of that was Brexit, but part of that was his promises on levelling up and saying these people hadn't had the proper attention that they should have got before, and that the Tories were going to do that. They were going to transform these areas. And I think there's a real risk at the moment that, partly because the Tories haven't managed to kind of deliver on their promises, partly because of other things, the state of the economy, what's happened with coronavirus and Ukraine, that I think a lot of people, when they go to the polling stations next time around, might look at their local area, might look at their high streets, and they will ask themselves, is our area better off than it was at the last election? Have the Tories managed to improve it? And I think a lot of people will look around and see a lot of closed shops, a lot of projects that haven't actually taken place. And I think that's going to be a difficult message for the Tories to sell to voters.
Well, yeah, and there will be a lot of examination, Kate, won't there, over fairness and whether the money's going to the right areas. But there's a report on the front of The Guardian which suggests that whatever money is being sent to these areas is also being squeezed by inflation. Basically, the councils have less spending ability because of the high costs going up.
Yeah, there's two slightly different stories, and they're both speaking to the same point, which is levelling up agenda. This one in The Guardian is talking about the fact that those levelling up bids that have been successful, those pots of money that different councils and areas have bid for and pocketed, well, those projects are getting more expensive. Why are they getting more expensive? Because of inflation. Everything's getting more expensive. So, that £30 million pot of money you might have got to redo your high street or your train station or your shopping centre, well, suddenly you'd budgeted for kind of pre-massive inflation project, and now you don't quite have the money to cover it. And that's what this Guardian article is speaking to, the fact that even successful levelling up bids now might be fast running out of cash. I just wanted to bring in here the IPPR report, which John talked about, which is on the front of the Metro, because I think it's quite a fascinating issue, really. It speaks to an issue that all governments grapple with, which is for a long time, actually, if we're honest, over 100 years, large parts of the Midlands, large parts of the North have lagged behind the South and the South East in terms of wealth and productivity. And every successful government has promised to try and turn that around. We know about Boris Johnson and his levelling up agenda, but before that you would have had Tony Blair, his New Deal for Communities. Before that you had John Major and Thatcher and what they did in Liverpool and the Docklands. And I think this speaks to the heart of the problem for this government, which is, how are you going to somehow leverage in private sector investment and get growth going? And that's the big issue for the government.
Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, John Stevens and Kate Ferguson. And Kate, we're turning to the Daily Telegraph next, and a small news in brief on their front page about Nadeem Zahawi. I don't know how relieved he might be that he's not splashed across more of the front pages again today, but what is this little article here saying about the controversy over his tax affairs?
So this is an interview Lord Evans has given today. He is chairman on the Committee for Public Standards, and he's criticising Nadeem Zahawi for his use of aggressive lawyers. So your listeners and viewers will know that this Nadeem Zahawi story has been rumbling on for over 6 months now, really. It was first reported that there were questions raised about what tax he paid back in the day when he sold up YouGov, whether or not he had dodged or avoided paying tax because of a complicated share system thing that he used. And most recently, obviously, we reported originally in The Sun on Sunday that he'd settled that dispute with HMRC, coughing up millions to settle the dispute. And that includes a reported £1.2 million fine. Now, what Lord Evans is saying here is that over the past 6 months, when he's faced those questions, that scrutiny about what tax he paid, when was he under investigation, what was he settling with HMRC, he was being simply too aggressive in his use of legal letters to both journalists and investigative, I guess you'd call them researchers, tax experts who online were delving into this as well. And he's raising the point that if you do go into government, you're going into public life, you expect higher levels of scrutiny, and that's not really consistent with penning quite aggressive, expensive legal letters.
OK, and in the meantime, the government's ethics advisor, of course, examining whether or not Nadeem Zahawi broke the ministerial code. We've got 30 seconds, John. I've got to whiz you on to the Metro. Irish eyes are smiling. Why are they smiling? Very briefly.
They are smiling because the Oscar nominations were out today. Loads of people from Ireland are on there. The guy from Normal People. Goodness sakes, I can't remember the list of the rest of them.
Paul Mescal, I think is the name you were searching for there. Anyway, we're out of time.